it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Jeff Covin, who was the Samuel and Pauline Globinger Professor of Entrepreneurship in Indiana University. Those of you who remember the ranking of universities publishing entrepreneurship research, you know Indiana was among the top. His PhD was from University of Pittsburgh in the US, a very strong program. Research interests in corporate entrepreneurship, as you saw a few minutes ago. He was ranked among the top published corporate entrepreneurship scholars in the papers you read. Entrepreneurial orientation, innovation, published in the top journals: Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Business Venturing, ET&P, Journal of Management, many others. He's an outstanding mentor to many outstanding PhD students, including some of you may remember Dr. Brian Anderson, who was a guest speaker in VSSCR 21. Dr. Anderson was a student of Jeff Covin in the PhD program. And let me say on a personal note that Jeff is one of the nicest human beings that you will ever meet, one of the kindest and nicest people in this profession. With that, Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Michelle. I appreciate your kind words. As always, you give me too much credit, though, but thank you. Looking forward to the session today.
So, Jeff, let me start with a question, and then we do have some questions from audience already, but we'll get to that in a few minutes.
Okay.
So, how did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? I'm assuming that it wasn't like you were 6 years old and saying, I want to be an entrepreneurship researcher when I grow up. So how did that happen?
It's an interesting story. I'm not sure if I ever mentioned this to you, but Vishal, but so I was studying top management style and looking at how management style needs to fit with strategy and how the fit between management style and strategy affects performance. And Denny Slevin at the University of Pittsburgh was my chair. And he said, Jeff, if you can, and I was doing some survey research, I was using Pradeep Khandwala's measures of top management style, the various dimensions, some of the measures of Anil Gupta looking at strategy and performance, and I was just melding these together. Denny said, Jeff, if you can put some items measuring entrepreneurship into your data collection effort, I can get $500 for you to offset the cost of data collection. So I looked at Pradeep Khandwala's risk-taking style and I said, man, it doesn't quite capture being entrepreneurial. So I augmented Pradeep Khandwala's risk-taking style with measures I generated on my own, and that eventually evolved into the entrepreneurial orientation scales. So that's 2 or 3 measures of Pradeep Khandwala, a couple of Danny Miller's items, and I think I added 4 items. You add it up, it comes to 9. And interestingly, Vishal, that's the only thing that turned out of my dissertation. Everything else washed. But it was pure serendipity that got me onto this track.
So Jeff, if we were to go a little further back, how did you decide to do even a PhD, right? I don't see many first-year undergraduate students saying, this is my path, like I'm going to be a PhD in business. So how did you make that decision?
It has a lot to do with my background in socioeconomic class, and to make what could be a long comment short, you know, I knew I had to do well in school. I knew I needed to make my way in the world. I needed to get a job. I needed to earn income. I grew up in an area of the country that was the Rust Belt, and the good factory jobs are going away. So I really studied hard as an undergraduate. And I discovered that on a good day, I was pretty good at school. So then I discovered that, wait a minute, they'll actually pay me to go to school. And I got a graduate research assistantship. But basically, I just wanted to differentiate myself. I worked so hard, and I wanted to have a basis for hiring me that differentiated me from other persons. And I was an undergraduate business major. And I had a lot of admiration and respect for my college professors. I thought this would be an honorable way to spend one's career, and I had seemingly adequate proficiency. So I just went from undergraduate to MBA to, I was in a PhD program with an MBA by the time I was 21. So I had a fast start.
Jeff, now coming to corporate entrepreneurship research, people have read your papers for today, of course, but can you share with us your insights on sort of the problems and opportunities in the extant corporate entrepreneurship literature? What do you think is the past and future of this area?
You know, Don Caraco and I talk a lot about the history of corporate entrepreneurship in the chapter that many of you may have read, but in a nutshell, what we see when we study corporate entrepreneurship are lots of small N studies and lots of case studies. And then we see a lot of corporate venture capital research, and then we see a lot of entrepreneurial orientation research. And those three buckets sort of dominate what we see. And that's part of the problem. We study things for which data are easily collected, not necessarily the most important thing. So if you look at the corporate venture capital research, you would think that the greatest part of the phenomenon of corporate entrepreneurship is corporate venture capital funds. The fact of the matter is, such a small percentage of corporations have corporate venture capital funds. And you ask, well, why does it dominate the corporate entrepreneurship literature? It's because it's something that you alluded to, Vishal, archival data are available. You look at entrepreneurial orientation research, and why is there so much of that? Well, you know, that scale that I was part of, and you know, I know you've done a lot of entrepreneurial orientation research. It tends to work repeatedly in different contexts, and you know, folks throw it into their survey measures, and you know, as often as not, something turns out. But you know, part of the challenge is so much of what constitutes corporate entrepreneurship is hidden within organizations, and archival data simply aren't available. Secondary data aren't available, and we study things for which we can collect data, and even things like construct agreement, construct measurement have proven to be problematic. You know, you participated in this conversation over the years of what does it mean to be entrepreneurial, and what is an entrepreneurial orientation. So, you know, that's a challenge. And there's also a bias against certain type of research. And for example, yeah, I may elaborate a bit later, but you know, several years ago, I decided that I didn't simply want to look at entrepreneurial orientation as an attribute of organizations and as a manifestation of corporate entrepreneurship. I wanted to look at a specific entrepreneurial phenomenon, an activity. So I designed a major study, and it took me months to read literally everything in the literature. Designed a major study on internal corporate venturing, and I wanted to see what predicts internal corporate venture success, because remarkably, even though internal corporate venturing is a ubiquitous, pervasive phenomenon, the number of large-scale studies on the topic is a few dozen published in major journals. Why is that? Well, the data are invisible, they're hard to collect. So I decided, well, if I'm going to do a deep dive in these organizations, I'm going to design something big, a very ambitious project. You know, I developed about 18 measures of factors, things that I wanted to look at, like learning venture relatedness, transferability of assets, venture structuring, things that I thought would predict internal corporate venturing performance. And then when I tried to publish this study, I had some success, but folks don't like when you try to publish multiple studies from a single database. It can become a real challenge. And it's interesting that so I spent a year and a half, tens of thousands of dollars collecting data, and am I going to publish one study with that? No, but that's what it takes to do the deep dive in lots of organizations, that not simply have anecdotal evidence or a case study. Of course, case studies can take a very long time too. So there are disincentives and factors that discourage folks from studying corporate entrepreneurial phenomena in the depth that I think they really need to be studied.
And when you are a reviewer and an editor, what do you look for in a paper? What you just talked about was sort of how the world looks like from an author's perspective, right? Somebody spending thousands of dollars. But what happens when you're on the other side?
What do I look for? I look for the practical significance of the contribution. In other words, you need to be predicting or explaining something that I care about, something that matters, something that managers care about, something that's discussed ideally in the popular business press, that it's not simply an academic, and it needs to be non-obvious. We have so many folks who have a lot to say about academic matters they're just scholars talking with other scholars and trying to demonstrate how smart we are, how clever we are, and how esoteric we are. I like papers that I can sink my teeth into, that they have something to say, that there's a strong message. What I look for, beyond those factors, is scholarly talent. Have the folks express their thoughts with insightfulness, with clarity. I ask myself, even if I don't fully understand or agree with, is there enough talent evident and obvious in the writing that I feel I can engage in a potentially developmental conversation with these folks? I don't necessarily have to agree. I don't necessarily have to find the contribution to be of great magnitude. But if they do something well, if it makes a solid incremental contribution in a domain of practical significance, that's what I look for. And I have to admit, I tend to be an easy reviewer, and I think over the years I've become easier as I appreciate just how hard it is to publish. We have a world full of very bright, hardworking scholars competing for slots in the same journals. So if the authors give me something that I can feel I can work with, I'll almost always give it a revise and resubmit. Having been a junior professor years ago, I must say, but recognizing how hard it is, I want more folks in our profession. I don't want folks to be turned off by condescending reviewer comments.
So Jeff, I'm sure you already won over many people when you said you're an easy reviewer. And many people here, including me, are now hoping that we get you as a reviewer next time we submit a paper. But let me ask you one more question before I turn it over to the audience.
Okay.
Can you tell us about one corporate entrepreneurship paper that you're working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the research team? Where are you on that paper?
Okay. One of them is, I have a couple papers under review now from the internal corporate venturing study that I conducted along with my former doctoral student, Bobby Garrett. And I'll just elaborate a bit on one of them. So, I talked a minute ago to Shaw about how I wanted to understand what makes internal corporate ventures successful. So in this study, I had venture performance as my DV, and I had lots of factors that predicted venture performance. And one of those that I looked at was the planning autonomy. To what extent is the venture manager or managers given the freedom to make the decisions on their own, as opposed to having the decisions regarding their venture's operations dictated from above. And what I found is, consistent with a lot of the literature, planning autonomy predicts performance. But in this study of mine, I had this large model, and I also asked, okay, I think this is going to be true, but what predicts venture autonomy, autonomous decision-making by the venture managers? And, I have this theory about how that comes about. And one of the factors that I anticipated when I put together my measures was, well, the degree to which the venture is related to other products of the corporation or other markets served. So I have a paper looking at the relationship between how related an internal corporate venture is to other businesses and the extent to which that venture would then be granted planning autonomy. And I found some interesting results that relate to degree of type of relatedness, whether it's related in a product sense or market sense. And I find moderating effects of learning and financial slack. So that's a paper that's under review now at a journal, first round review. How do I put together the team? After my sabbatical, at the end of my sabbatical, when I designed this large scale study, Bobby Garrett, who's a great fellow, he's an associate dean now at University of Louisville, was my doctoral student, and he was interested in studying internal corporate venturing. So I got the use of Bobby for literally a year and a half. He did nothing but go out and collect data. That was his entire life, based on the set of instruments that I put together. So, Bobby is my partner in crime, and we just regarded this as a joint database, and have a couple of other collaborators on this project. One of the challenges of not being a recent PhD is I missed out on lots of the sophisticated quantitative analyses courses that are taught these days. So what I didn't have is the analytical proficiency. But I have a dear friend and co-author, Ricardo Banken, who is a chair of the strategic management group at the University of Bayreuth, and she and her research team joined as co-authors, or several members of her research team, Till Gernert, Maximilian Deist, and did a lot of the analyses to verify that what we thought we were looking at, we were actually looking at. So basically it was Bobby and me, and we recognized that in order to have this research potentially publishable in a top-tier journal, we needed complementary competencies in terms of the research team. And Ricarda and her colleagues are just outstanding analysts. So we invited them aboard. But in general, why do I work with people? I work with people that I like, that I respect, people who are going to give the project their full efforts and not pass something along that they then expect me or whoever else on the team to clean up after them. So that's what I look for.
Perfect, Jeff. With that, we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. Let's start with Fred or Sanjay. Both of you had questions for corporate entrepreneurship. Either of you want to go ahead?
Yes, I can go ahead first. Thank you, Professor Covin. Thanks for interesting insights. I have one question. We were discussing about the three, I can say, dimensions of corporate entrepreneurship. One is corporate venturing, one is strategic entrepreneurship, and third is entrepreneurial. Are all these three overlapping, or you can say they combine to develop corporate entrepreneurship? What's your thought process on that?
So Thank you for the question, Sanjay. Bill Wells and I published a paper on entrepreneurial orientation. I think it was 2019 in entrepreneurship theory and practice. And I talk about the similarities and differences between entrepreneurial orientation and other forms of corporate entrepreneurship. But I think that as a sort of umbrella construct, corporate entrepreneurship includes entrepreneurial orientation, and it includes specific manifestations or activities of being entrepreneurial in organizations. So I see entrepreneurial orientation as an attribute of firms, and corporate entrepreneurship as being activities within firms. In terms of corporate venturing, venturing is just corporations starting in or investing in new businesses. Corporate venture capital is just one way to make that happen. The odd duck there is this concept of strategic entrepreneurship, because ever since it was advocated by Mike, Dwayne Ireland, way back when, people have grabbed that construct, that label, and used it to refer to different specific phenomena. So when I talk about strategic entrepreneurship, I think of it existing in organizations in the form of innovation with a big I, in innovation in terms of major market innovation, major product innovation, major strategic innovation, major business model innovation, major organizational innovation. The chapter talks a bit about that, but you're not going to find agreement on what strategic entrepreneurship means. And because of that conceptual ambiguity, despite some interesting conceptual essays, there's not a critical mass of papers that look at the phenomena of strategic entrepreneurship that are looking at the same specific phenomena. And it's contributed to a bit of confusion. So I'm not surprised that you have that question. I simply recommend to scholars that when you use the term, you say specifically what you mean, because if you don't, others who are reading your paper will project their own notions onto what you are or should be talking about.
That's very good advice, Jeff. Thank you. Dawn, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Covin. Great talk, and I enjoyed your article. I have a more general question about data in the entrepreneurial field. Having spent a significant amount of time just trying to find, I work with angel investors, so trying to find enough angel investors and additional information to continue with research. Do you have any advice on data sources or how to get around not having a lot of data?
I'm going to be candid here, Dawn. Not that I wouldn't be, but I've always started off with lots of scholars, and there's a major incentive to do this. Try to find an existing database and then say, okay, what questions can I answer with this database? I've done probably a whole lot less of that than others sort of at my career stage. That's the smart thing to do. I haven't always done that, but I've always started with a research question, and as opposed to notions of what data are available. And then, I've done a lot of survey research where I've developed instruments to measure exactly what I wanted to measure. Whether I measured them well or not is open to debate. But I've always started with big questions, and then I thought about, okay, how do I answer this question? And if there aren't secondary data available, I naturally go to, all right, I'm going to develop the scale. And I've been doing that literally for 40 years. So others can probably give you more useful a more useful answer to that question, because in terms of what is available out there for corporate entrepreneurship, all I know is when I think of the things that I'm interested in studying, the data simply aren't out there in secondary databases. One of the downsides of that is, some of my favorite papers have come from this internal corporate venturing database. Those papers aren't going to be cited nearly as often as some of my entrepreneurial orientation papers, because there aren't any, there aren't 1,000 scholars around the world studying internal corporate venturing, but there are 1,000 scholars studying entrepreneurial orientation. So I've always been research question driven as opposed to data driven. And because of that, I don't have a good sense of where to point you, unfortunately, Don. I wish I did.
Oscar, you want to go next?
Yes, Professor. Professor, thank you for your presentation and for your sharing your experience with us. Super rich, very interesting. My question is regarding one of the commentaries that you made at the beginning. You said that when you start researching about entrepreneurial orientation at the beginning, you start with 2 or 3 items to measure. Okay.
Yes.
Then you mentioned that today you can establish more or less 18 factors that we can measure to define entrepreneurial orientation. So my question is, how many do we need to validate to consider that in an organization do we have entrepreneurial orientation?
Okay, I probably didn't communicate clearly, Oscar. Thank you for your question. When I said 18 factors, what I was referring to is not looking at entrepreneurial orientation, but in a subsequent study, I probably designed 18 new multi-item measures that weren't entrepreneurial orientation, but were things like strategic evolution. How does the strategy change in an internal corporate venture? Or venture interdependence. How is an internal corporate venture interdependent with other businesses? With respect to entrepreneurial orientation and how that developed out, basically that's an interesting thing, Oscar. If Danny Miller had published his scale, I never would have tried to augment it with additional items. He talked about his entrepreneurial orientation scale in papers that he published in the early 80s, but he never published the full scale. So I just went back to his writings, and he's a brilliant scholar, and it's been a privilege to co-author a paper with me. If you've not read Danny Miller's research, he's a genius.
I read yours. I read yours with him. I read the paper that you read with him about the international entrepreneurial orientation.
Oh, okay. So I'm just a cog in the wheel. I was standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and I tried to make an incremental contribution, filling in some of the blanks that he left without publishing all of the scales that he used to collect his data. So basically, I just generated additional items to more fully reflect the construct as I understood he was describing it. And quite fortuitously, that 9-item scale tends to have a predictable alpha coefficient, and it works well. It's not like there was anything special or brilliant about me. I got lucky. I'll tell you that. That was very early in my career. And what's fortuitous is the phenomenon in practice exists as he explained it theoretically, and with a combination of his items and Pradeep Kondala's and some that I augmented theirs with. We find that phenomenon actually exists in practice. And now, with respect to dimensionality, there are just different ways of looking at what it means to be entrepreneurial. And that scale, Oscar, focuses on what one might argue all entrepreneurial firms have in common, but it doesn't, by intent, look at how entrepreneurial firms can be different. So that's where Tom Lumping and Greg Dess jump in, and they say that entrepreneurial orientation can be looked at in terms of these 5 dimensions. They don't have to covary, and they're absolutely right. Theirs is just a different focus. Theirs is a focus on differences among entrepreneurial firms. What I focus on traditionally is what entrepreneurial firms might have in common. And critically, Oscar, there's not a right and wrong. You know, you just have to acknowledge which construct you're adhering to when you're researching this phenomenon. But the bigger question that I've been trying to answer for decades is, what does it mean to be entrepreneurial, and to what effect? And there's not a single answer to that. There are lots of answers and lots of different measures that can be employed in trying to answer those questions.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes, sir.
Ed, you want to go next? Ed?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was having difficulties to click on the mic. So thank you very much for all these great insights. And I was wondering if you could recommend me some paper who would make a link between the ambidexterity and corporate entrepreneurship. I have the kind of feeling, but perhaps that I'm wrong, that it's something which is not yet been addressed a lot. This fact that you are conducting both modes in corporates, so exploitation and exploration, and then that entrepreneurship could provide a way to reach it. But I was not able to find any paper making this link, or perhaps there are no links. I don't know what's your point of view regarding that.
No, there are links, and there are papers out there, Fred, that I think can be helpful. That's absolutely an element of corporate entrepreneurship theory and research that I would encourage the scholars to pursue in lots of different ways. So there's ambidexterity with respect to exploration and exploitation. There's also this structural ambidexterity of having an operating core versus the innovation silo. But go into Google Scholar, type in ambidexterity. I know that Julian Birkinshaw has written a paper that I think could be very helpful. Chris Shalley and I think Anil Gupta have written a paper. It's an Academy Management Executive, I believe, that could be very helpful. Bill Wells in the 2011 ETP special issue that Tom Lumpkin and I co-edited has a paper that relates to ambidexterity that could be very helpful. Those are ones that come to mind, but in general, I do think the whole ambidexterity issue is really important. What complements being entrepreneurial? For example, lots of questions there. For example, if a company has a high entrepreneurial orientation, what do they need to appropriate maximum value? They need some sort of control orientation too, obviously. With even more specific corporate entrepreneurial phenomenon, what compensates? How do you align innovative initiatives with the strategy of a firm? So you have the control side, and then you have the innovation side, and you need to balance these things. Those are big questions in corporate entrepreneurship. You know, we've seen decades starting in the 80s and 90s of how to unleash the entrepreneurial hostages in companies, but we haven't seen a commensurate interest and emphasis on directing, controlling, managing, and leveraging the innovative efforts. So more research in that domain, I think, would be very helpful.
Okay, so thank you very much. But indeed, it's not very easy to find a way and to try to, or at least I didn't find it yet, but there are indeed many papers about ambidexterity and the impact of it, case studies and all these kind of stuff, but the link is difficult to find. So
well, I'll look forward to reading your paper on that topic, because it's one that needs to be written, my friend.
okay,
because it's there. It's there. You're not just dreaming that up. More needs to be done in that area. So I think that it's worthwhile putting in the time and effort to think those matters through, because they are significant matters, theoretically and practically.
Thank you very much for the insights. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Vimal, you want to go next, Vimal? Vimal, you want to go next?
Hi. Hello, Jeff. Am I audible?
Hello.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to ask a slightly different question from the ongoing discussion. This is regarding my area of interest in qualitative research. I would like to understand in this regard 2 to 3 research gaps that you have came across all this while in your long career of research in the field of entrepreneurship, corporate entrepreneurship. What are those potential 2 to 3 areas which you may like to suggest where qualitative research methods can be employed, and we can think of writing and publishing in leading journals? And my second small question is, do you think qualitative papers are normally considered, or if it is written well, with following some basic criteria in top tier journals or A-star journals or A journals? What is your opinion about it? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Here's a challenge that I see with qualitative research. In corporate entrepreneurship, it absolutely makes sense because of the inherent complexity, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the challenge is, I think many of us recognize, is so often the value of qualitative research seems to be in the eye of the reader, and even if it's one making novel, insightful observations. Unless the reader is also an informed expert, he or she may say, well, this is just old wine in new bottles. We all know this. Haven't you read such and such? So I think the risk factor in qualitative research in top tier journals, or in any journals, is somewhat high, because it's more difficult to evaluate. It can be more difficult to evaluate quality, particularly if someone is a good writer. And it expresses themselves clearly. So I don't mean to sound discouraging, but I just think that with quantitative research, we have these tools and litmus tests to know, to have a better sense of quality and, arguably novelty. But I think that the opportunities are really there for qualitative research in corporate entrepreneurship, and I'll give you an example of one that I really wish we would see more research of the following type. So often when we study corporate entrepreneurial phenomena, we study distinct individual phenomena taken out of context. And say it's internal corporate venturing, something I study. So I look at corporations in what they're doing in internal corporate venturing, but I don't concurrently look at their licensing activities, at their joint ventures, at their product development, at their acquisition. There are all of these tools that are used to enact corporate business renewal and corporate entrepreneurship strategy. And we tend to piecemeal it because empirically studying all of these things is very complex. Going in to a company or small end companies, looking at, for example, the fits and the misfits between these tools to enact corporate innovation, we really need something like that. I can tell you, having spoken with executives of lots of the largest companies in the US that are engaged in corporate entrepreneurship, a lot of these companies, they're filled with brilliant analysts and business managers are throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks. They don't know what's going on in other corporations because corporations keep these kind of things secret. Yet there is a portfolio of activities all these firms are engaged in. Some are linked, some are congruent, others are incongruent. And qualitative research of that form, I think, would really be helpful in enabling us to understand what corporate entrepreneurship looks like in a more global sense than in a micro sense. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
David Hahn, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Davide Hahn from the University of Bergamo. By the way, I knew Robert Garrett because he went here in Italy to do a visiting in the Center for Young and Family Enterprises. So we went together to dinner and so on. He's really an amazing guy.
he's a good guy.
My question was related more to the last development of entrepreneurial orientation as an individual level construct. And I wonder if there are some studies, or it might be interesting to study, it makes sense to link this type of construct to the entrepreneurial learning literature. Because I'm studying entrepreneurship education, and so I'm interested to how can you nurture somehow entrepreneurship in a university context. And I wonder if whether entrepreneurial orientation can be seen as something that can be somehow developed or learned, or is it more a static, let's say, attribute? Because in most of the papers on entrepreneurial orientation, you see somehow a kind of, I don't know if it's correct, but it seems like entrepreneurial orientation, it's quite static, something that you have or you don't have, and then you analyze the implication of it. But I wonder if it will make sense to see it as a more kind of dynamic attribute and study, I don't know, its antecedents, the antecedents of its formation or so on.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and maybe fortuitous. Well, I know fortuitously for me, but I'm in the process of writing a paper along with one of my former doctoral students, Dan Clark, and Rob Pittick, and Tom Lumpkin on this notion of I can't remember on the final, if we agreed on the final title, but basically we're asking, is it okay to think of entrepreneurial orientation as an individual level construct? And even that question is kind of a silly question, because the answer is, well, it depends on what you mean by entrepreneurial orientation. As originally proposed, entrepreneurial orientation is a firm level construct. And what folks have done is use the theory of the firm and try to somehow convert that to individual attributes. And it's just been awkward and doesn't work well. So, what we're arguing is let's take this from scratch. What are individual level entrepreneurial constructs collectively exhaustive, or is there room for something that we might conceive of as individual or entrepreneurial orientation? And if so, how would that differ, and where would it overlap with things like entrepreneurial passion or entrepreneurial intention, or some of these constructs? So we're still working out the details in this paper, but we are contrasting individual EO or how it may be conceived that's not a firm level with other individual level entrepreneurial phenomena. Now, with respect to entrepreneurial learning, can you teach someone to be more entrepreneurially oriented? I think the answer to that is yes, we can, but teaching someone to engage in entrepreneurial behavior doesn't necessarily mean that they have an entrepreneurial orientation. What we're proposing is that just like the manifestation of EO based on what's examined in the scale that I was part of, looks at preferences and attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. What we're arguing is that an individual level entrepreneurial orientation can't just look at behaviors. It has to look at more attitudinal factors too. And there's this combination of factors that triangulates to suggest that someone is truly being entrepreneurial. It's not just opportunistic. They're not engaging in behaviors that they don't truly believe in, and likewise, it's not just they believe in the virtue of entrepreneurial action, but they're not engaging in it. I think to have an individual level entrepreneurial orientation, you need both. You need to be an entrepreneur, or else you don't have an entrepreneurial orientation, and you need to have the attitude that this is a good thing. Can you teach that? Learning, could be an antecedent to developing the attitudes, appreciation, beliefs that entrepreneurial action is key to one's, personal welfare, and the behaviors that are consistent with those beliefs. So yeah, I think one can leap to that one answer. And the other thing, yes, I think there is room in the literature for an individual construct that we can think of as entrepreneurial orientation, but let's just leave entrepreneurial orientation as we conceive of it as a firm level construct to not confuse things. Risk-taking, innovation, proactiveness, whatever. That's been run up the flagpole. People are saluting. We understand. Let's not confuse things. But there is room for an additional individual level construct that looks like entrepreneurial orientation, is what we're arguing in this paper.
Okay. Sorry if I ask, because another related question, because it's stimulated by your, if you have, do you see, or is entrepreneurial orientation more a matter of willingness or ability, or both? So for example, risk-taking, you have somehow the willingness to take risk, but at the same time, probably risk-taking contains an element of ability. So you have also the ability to assess risk and take it. I don't know how to say.
That's a good question. Here's how I want to respond to that. You have people who are, I'll call them purists. Another word might be naive, but I could be wrong. Yeah. That say that this construct must be a behavioral construct, or it must be an attitudinal, it must be an ability, or must be this, that, or the other. I would submit that, for example, the entrepreneurial orientation scale consistently predicts firm performance, because it doesn't just look at one thing. It looks at beliefs, preferences, behaviors, and attitudes. So it triangulates these things. And basically, firms that score highly on this scale have all of those things going for it. And when you have all of those things going for it, you can truly say that those are entrepreneurial firms, because they believe in it, and they have actions and preferences and cognitions that reflect the inherent value of that behavior. So, you know, I think that is the value of the scale, and we can more confidently say that firms are more entrepreneurial if they exhibit all of these things. And some people say, well, the weakness of that scale is it mixes things. And I say wrong. The strength of that scale is it's corroborating, it triangulates, and similarly, it's the ability and it's the attitude. It's both of those things together. So, you know, I would make what I'm trying to do here, sir, is make a parallel argument to why I think it's both.
So
thank you so much for these answers. I'm very grateful.
You're very welcome.
Jeff, I know we've exhausted our 45 minutes with you. Are you willing to still take more questions? Or?
Of course, of course.
Okay. Navneet, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Vishal. And my question to Professor Jeff is, since you have been researching in corporate entrepreneurship, I just wanted to know, is there adequate study on failure of corporate entrepreneurs and corporate enterprise failure? And is there any study or a need to study the survival strategies for these type of firms, corporate and enterprise? I just wanted to know your views on that.
There are studies. Dean Shepard has done some really nice work on corporate entrepreneurship and failure. You know, he and I have at JBB years ago. So if you look up Dean Shepard's work, there's lots of wisdom to be garnered by reading some of his work. Entrepreneurship, corporate entrepreneurship, and failure is a really important phenomenon to study. You know, we learn from our failures, much less so from our successes. And I can tell you, in my large-scale study of internal corporate venturing, about a third of them succeeded. It means about 2/3 of those for which I collected data failed. And companies need mechanisms for ensuring that they don't lose the wisdom gained when they have to terminate these ventures or they're otherwise become defunct. So I think there's anecdotal a lot of anecdotal research about the value of failure. More large-scale systematic studies of multiple corporations looking at failure dynamics or processes in corporations are few and far between. But the whole failure phenomenon is really interesting. I mentioned my friend Danny Miller's work earlier. If you've not read his work, The Icarus Paradox, it's fascinating about how success leads to failure, and because one doesn't pay attention to the cues, to the disconfirming information and the like, but then it becomes, well, what do you do with those failures? How do you capture the value? How do you fall forward, according to Rita McGrath? So yeah, that's an area that I often suggested and believe is ripe for additional corporate entrepreneurship research.
James, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. I have sort of a follow-up question. I'll start by saying thank you very much, Professor Covin, and hail Pitt. As a fellow alum from the University of Pittsburgh. In terms of your comments on, I'll say, secondary data availability and bias, or incentives or disincentives, I guess what keeps me up at night in my own research, I'm a longtime corporate venturing practitioner, M&A as well, patent, the whole, corporate innovation side, a recent academic doctoral graduate. So beginning of my academic career, but what keeps me up at night is the entrepreneurship data. And even I question when I look at my own research is the data is highly biased towards success. And I'll say Parker, I think, coined it as it's akin to studying gambling by only looking at winners.
Right.
And in the corporate environment, you know, even the idea of like fail fast, no one wants to adopt fail fast. And you're like 1/3 are successful. It's probably more like 5 or 10% are successful, but the rest are buried. So I think that's what keeps me up at night. And
Yeah.
Can you make a comment on the struggle with getting the data and really for completeness, right, and robustness in terms of qualitative research?
Yeah. Well, thanks, James, for the comment and question. One, you know, I think there is a relative benefit to studying failure in corporations because you know one can often find access if you have a good relationship to individuals who were involved in efforts that have been terminated. It's much harder if your parameters aren't circumscribed by the corporate context. Just but having said that, yeah, there's undoubtedly a failure bias. And, you know, but Vishal knows this. You know, we study entrepreneurial orientation, talk about the importance of risk taking, and in general, you know, higher EO leads to higher performance. That's studying those that are left standing. You know, so most EO research has a survivor bias, and you just have to acknowledge that. New business ventures in corporations, by definition, new businesses means you're diversifying into something that you don't know. That's why the failure level is so high. The only way I know to get around that is to actually go into corporations and talk with people. And you know, that doesn't guarantee that you'll be given full information or that they'll be candid. But there's, you know, I wish I had an easy get around for you or work around, but there really is none. Acknowledging the fact that you know, even in product development, most product development efforts are based on marginally different products. And what we know, what we think we know from, you know, decades of research is maybe 60% of new product efforts succeed, 60%, based on new products that are only marginally different from existing products. So that's 40% of things that we think we know about are failing. It's, you know, I unfortunately, I don't have any words of wisdom. Acknowledge it, do your best to find, you know, evidence of the dead soldiers, so to speak. What I found is that going in the corporation, talking with the managers, developing rapport, guaranteeing anonymity, people will talk with you. You just can't tell anyone else about who you're talking to and what they told you. They'll track you down.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
So Jeff, we continue to have a lot of questions, but we also need to bring the session to a close.
Okay.
So I will ask, so let me ask you this. Is it okay if people who have more questions, they reach out to you by email or any other means and ask their questions?
Of course. Yeah, I'm just covin@indiana.edu. And I'll be happy.
Perfect, Jeff. And I'll share your email with them also, just to make sure they have. But let me finish with the two questions I like to finish with, which is, you started this in this profession 40 years ago. And, you know, like you said, you've always done survey research. Now, is it correct that over the last few years in good strategy journals, the trend has sort of shift away from survey research towards archival and other forms of research, or do you don't think that shift is happening?
I think that shift has absolutely happened. Absolutely. You made some very accurate and insightful comments about the need for example, if someone is, it used to be easier to publish survey data. It's harder now. The standards have gotten higher. If someone is an informant, not just a respondent, but informing about a phenomenon, you better get multiple informants and calculate interrelated reliabilities. So the expectations with respect to survey research are increasingly stringent. And I think the pressure to publish is causing folks to focus first and foremost on easily accessible databases. And in strategy, we're seeing lots of modeling papers and experimental papers and things like that we didn't see before. But yeah, I would agree with that assessment of bias toward archival. We see lots of computer-aided text analysis-based studies today, and similar methods that are replacing some of the more traditional methods in entrepreneurship and strategy research.
So I guess from that perspective, research has become more methodologically diverse, and I guess that's a good thing.
That is a good thing. That is a good thing. Yes.
So my last question, which I ask of all speakers, is if you were to offer one advice to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers, which is the audience here, what would your advice be?
I'm going to quote my friend Mike Hitt. Years ago, I was chairing the Entrepreneurship Doctoral Consortium, and he was asked for his advice, and he said something, and it's always stuck with me, and it's my truth too. When you're conducting, and this is not just entrepreneurship research, it's any research. When you're conducting research, don't cut any corners. And by that, I mean, collect all the data you need, collect the data on control measures, corroborating measures, learn the domain that you're studying, know it well, know it forward and backwards, know the techniques. Just don't fail to do everything that you might do to make it high quality research. Just do it. If it takes more time, if it's more effortful, and I know this is easier said than done, but we picked a tough profession where the hurdles are high. So don't take the easy path. Get good measures, get corroborating measures, get control measures, know the analytical techniques, know the literature, ask the right questions. Don't cut any corners. Full stop.
And Jeff, with that, I think your own research sort of exemplifies that, right? Where it's survey based, but that is multi-respondents, across time, So I think that's very good advice in terms of not cutting any corners and being rigorous in research. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you for your time. And with that, Jeff, let me say how delighted we were to have you here. I took lots of notes as you spoke, and I am sure the other people on the call also took copious notes as you spoke. Thank you.
Well, thank you, my friend. And folks, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually, and hopefully our paths will cross in person one of these days.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye-bye.
Take care. Have a great day.